I'm assuming that you think that there's no way to have good faith negotiations with the Putin regime in its current form doing what it's doing on the ground in Ukraine. Is that your position?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't, look. It takes two good faith partners to begin negotiations. Clearly, Ukraine is not interested, as Russia is seizing and bombing its cities, and I don't think that Russia is a trustworthy partner in negotiations at this point.
Okay, Short Issues Podcast. We are here Wednesday, June 1st, 9 a.m. with a District 1 candidate, Dave Harden. How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you, Brian?
Very good. Glad to have you back. I mean, you're now officially a friend of the pod, pretty much.
I am a friend of the pod. I'm there.
Yeah. So I encourage anybody. We're not going to be talking about Dave's candidacy today. We're going to be talking about a foreign policy. A field that he's an expert in. But if you do want more info about Dave's candidacy for District 1, you can watch episode 4 or episode 5, whichever it is, and get more in depth with that. And also hardenforcongress.com is your website. Is that correct?
Yeah, hardenforcongress.com.
Okay, cool. So let's get past that. All right. So are you able to bring us up to date with what's going on with Ukraine, Russia? What are the most current reports coming that you're hearing?
Yeah, I mean, thanks. First of all, Brian, thanks for being having me on today. It's I really like what you do. I like how you connect big picture questions to the Eastern Shore, and I'm just pleased to be a part of your podcast.
Appreciate that.
So look, we're entering the 4th month of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's still very much in the headlines every single day. I do think there's a bit of a saturation point for readers because it just seems like we're entering into a slog. But I think that there's a few things that we can touch on during our discussion today. But I first think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not going to have a quick end. I think it's going to be a grinding slog that will have very, very heightened risk, not only for Ukrainians, but for all of Europe, for NATO, for America. I think there's tremendous spillover risks that we see in the Middle East and in Asia. And I think that there's profound economic implications on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which you see every day at the gas pump and at the grocery store. And so these things are all coming together almost with a perfect storm as we enter into the midterm elections, into a hot summer of 2022.
Okay, yeah. I remember when we were talking at the Harriet Tubman Festival, kind of feels like World War I is happening again or something like that. There's like these massive global changes in geopolitical alliances, a lot of fractures, inflation happening. If you're trying to make an appeal to a voter, like a person who's a layman that doesn't know very much about foreign politics, what would you say why they should care about the subject of the outcome of the Ukraine-Russia war?
Yes, look, I think your analogy to World War I is important and illustrative in many ways. And we're not at World War III, but there's a lot of risks ahead, and this could spin out in a way that's very, very dangerous. So while on the battlefield, this is a Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's really a Russian attack on all of Europe. And you see that with very monumental changes in Europe to this day. So, Germany, which had been essentially a demilitarized power since World War II, is now suddenly sending in material and support into Ukraine. Poland, which had been flirting with kind of a Putin-esque relationship and very close to Viktor Orban in Hungary, has been the transit point and the backbone of NATO. Finland and Sweden, which had for 70 years been officially neutral, has put in And we will see and of course, the United States is spending an enormous amount of money in support of Ukraine and Ukrainian freedom. So we will see a drawn-out war that will be catastrophic for people. We've seen millions of people displaced already, and the chance that we bump into a Russia-NATO conflict is real. And that will change everything. And I do want to talk about the economics, but from a military perspective, we haven't seen this kind of threat, this kind of risk since World War II. And it's certainly a more risky time than any time, even up through the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, it's not predictable about what the future will hold.
Okay. What do you think are the most worrisome outcomes that are possible of Russia-Ukraine at this moment? Like the looming hunger crisis, for example.
Yeah, there are many. There are many. I mean, we're going to divide this up into categories. So one is just the grinding nature of a World War I type of battle in the heart of Europe that continues to displace millions and results in mass devastation and global economic shock, right? That's the first thing. The second risk is that it spreads out beyond just Ukraine, it includes NATO. It may be an attack on Polish supplies coming in or across Poland, or the Ukrainians, launch an attack over the border into Russia, which there have been some rumors that they've done, and that it starts to spiral out of control and brings in NATO and the Western Alliance. I mean, I think the third in terms of Ukraine is that the Russians begin to lose and threaten or actually use tactical nuclear weapons, which would be immensely risky. And then of course, there's like the knock-on effects in Iran with their effort to try to build nuclear weapons, and in China with Taiwan, and in the Korean Peninsula. And I think very much so the risk to our global energy supply and our global food supply. So the risks are many. There are opportunities for the First District and for America that we should be cognizant of, but it is a critical time.
Right. So do you agree with, so the new news is that there's going to be some new EU sanctions. I guess the question is, do you think the sanction regime is working? And the new EU sanctions are now pledging to reduce their dependency on Russian oil and imports by 90% by the end of the year. Do you think this will have any effect, or is it too little too late?
I don't think it will change the course of the war itself. I do think it's important to do because we can't supply and support Ukraine and then at the same time have the Western Alliance fill the coffers of Russia by buying its oil. And so I think it's important to minimize that. I think the real biting sanctions would be secondary sanctions on anybody else that buys Russian oil, like India or China. We haven't gone that far yet. But the sanctions are necessary, but perhaps not sufficient in affecting the absolute outcome of the war. I just think that it's likely we should prepare for a long slog that will have real world implications for America, including, recessionary risk.
Right. So I'm assuming that you think that there's no way to have good faith negotiations with the Putin regime in its current form doing what it's doing on the ground in Ukraine. Is that your position?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, look, it takes two good faith partners to begin negotiations. Clearly, Ukraine is not interested, as Russia is seizing and bombing its cities. And I don't think that Russia is a trustworthy partner in negotiations at this point.
Okay. Okay, so let's talk about one of the more near and present dangers, the looming hunger crisis. Currently, Russia is blocking 22 to 28 million tons of grain export from the Black Sea. The UN says, as a result of this, 7.7 children under age 5 in the Sahel region are expected to suffer from malnutrition over the next 3 months, as well as places like Tanzania, Nigeria, Cameroon, also going to have higher levels of food insecurity. Part of this is a result of drought in Africa in recent times. But Zelensky yesterday said that this is something the Russian leadership clearly seeks. What do you think about his comment about that? Do you think that Putin is manufacturing a hunger crisis as a bargaining chip?
Yes. Yes. I mean, look, uh, the Kremlin understands global connectivity. They understand it's oil and what that means, and they also understand what food and food security means. So a couple of things are coming offline right now: Ukrainian commodities, wheat, etc., and Russian commodities also. And so that's why we're seeing a spike in food prices around the world, and also a spike in fertilizer for production. I ran America's Food for Peace program, where we bought food from around the world, and including, very importantly, from American farmers, and we shipped it to places where there was grave food insecurity. And so what I see right now is, first and foremost, a rise in pricing for food globally, and that will be a sticker shock for families on the Eastern Shore and in Hartford and Cecil County and parts of Baltimore that are in this Baltimore County that are in this district, and you see it every day at the grocery store, right? But higher food prices and more restrictive supply and more expensive logistics also create food insecurity in conflict-prone areas like the Sahel and in Yemen. And food insecurity creates grievances, and it creates conflict, and there's no doubt about it. And so Putin understands all of this, and Ukraine is in the breadbasket of Europe, and Russia has been a major agricultural supplier of food, and all of this is coming offline, and all of it will drive up prices at the grocery store and create grievance and food insecurity and conflict around the world. It's a massively destabilizing event.
What do you think Putin will seek to leverage with this bargaining chip that he has as of the manufactured food crisis? What do you think he wants to extract?
Look, I think between the food and the energy supply, I think he's trying to extract some kind of concessions in the heart of Central Europe that would allow him to keep a portion of Ukraine, or continue with a long, drawn-out war that will bring down the Zelensky regime. Whether he can achieve those goals, I don't know. But and look, the Ukrainians have been brave, and they have been strong, and they have been resilient, but they have also been well supplied. So it's not simply the Ukrainians, with pitchforks and tractors fighting the Russians. They've been getting some of the best equipment and supplies from the West, particularly from the United States. That's likely to continue. So I think, Putin's main goal is to inflict enough pain and pressure on the globe, including in America, to strike a bargain. And I think it's unlikely that that will succeed. So that's why I'm nervous about the risks associated with this war in Ukraine.
Do you think? Okay, so are you happy with Biden's current regime? So we've reinstated the Lend-Lease to Ukraine, so we're giving them aid. We're not giving them long-range artillery, but we are giving them some medium-range missiles in place of. Um, do you think that NATO or the U.S. should intervene as being like an escort convoy, perhaps, to the Black Sea to get this Ukrainian grain out of the Black Sea?
I mean, you're asking great questions. Look, I think Biden has done a good job in managing the Ukrainian risk, containing it, rebuilding the NATO alliance, sending warning signals to Iran and China and North Korea, and maintaining a strong Western alliance, not only in Western Europe, but also in Asia. So from that perspective, he's leveraged some of our strongest partners and allies in order to try to contain this risk. I think we need to be careful about of inserting ourselves into the Ukrainian theater with troops and let's say warships, because we want to minimize the friction points with NATO. So right now, the Ukrainians have done a good job, and they will continue to do a good job, and we should continue to support them. But we should not expand the war to take down Russia. That risk is real, and it may eventually come in our direction, but that's where it's real. I think Biden has suffered, though, in managing the economic spillout of the Ukrainian war. And I think some of his poor poll numbers and the heightened, risk of recession and sustained inflation make it difficult for him during these midterms. and to get a handle on the economy right now, so we can help working families that are suffering, and we can minimize the economic downside, is important, and I think he's fallen short on that
Okay. Mm-hmm. So do you think, for example, we should be sending more arms, for example, to Ukraine in that type of way?
I mean, my sense is that we've well supplied the Ukrainians. I mean, there are questions on the margins about MiGs and longer range missiles, et cetera. But my sense is that we've worked pretty lockstep with them, both from a materiel perspective, but also from an intelligence and humanitarian perspective. And so, I think we just need to be adroit and be able to change as the situation in theater changes. So I'm okay with where we are at the moment. I do think, though, we have to keep a strong eye on the Iranians and their walk away from the Iranian deal and any renegotiations of the Iranian deal. And we have to keep an eye on China with its designs on Taiwan, and we have to keep an eye on North Korea. Having said all that, fundamentally, though, people are worried about their economy at home and how they're going to make ends meet. And Biden is going to have to be able to do better in terms of putting dollars in the pockets of people who live in the first district. That's why I'm excited to run, because I think it's a complex world out there. And I've worked on the economics of conflict for 30 years, and we need to take a leadership role in making sure our folks are stabilized.
That's a great pivot because, talking about Biden having some unpopularity issues right now, as an important side theater, the Iran JCPOA negotiations have kind of been stalled for a few months now. Before we get into the meat of that, could you just describe what the JCPOA is first for people who don't like letters in a row? What is the JCPOA, and why should we care?
Yeah. So look, this is basically the acronym for the Iranian deal. It's the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that Obama and John Kerry put in place in order to contain and stop Iranian pursuit of nuclear weapons. Donald Trump pulled out of it. by every indication, the Iranians have marched much closer to nuclear capabilities. And it's true, we've not been able to strike a deal with them in order to contain that, and that those negotiations have stalled, and I think have probably, for intents and purposes right now, fatally stalled. And so this creates enormous anxiety in the Middle East, with the Israelis, but also the Saudis and the Emiratis. I just don't think that axis, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Israelis, will allow for a nuclear Iran. And so you see Biden going to the Middle East shortly. He's probably going to assure the Israelis, and then secondly, apparently he is going to go to Saudi Arabia, which there's a lot of controversy surrounding that visit. But it's clear that the Saudi-Israeli axis vis-a-vis Iran is going to be extremely unhappy with an Iranian nuclear breakout. And Iranian nuclear weapons affect Europe, and they affect the United States interests in a very deep way. So this is a real risk. Originally maybe if there was a blitzkrieg, it would have given more accelerant to the Iranians. If there was a blitzkrieg in Ukraine with Russia prevailing really quickly, but I think there has been some pause, at least, given the effectiveness of the West in responding to Ukraine and the sanctions that it's under. But look, we could be facing a world with a massive, slow grinding, frozen war in Central Europe, and a empowered nuclear Iran, and a very skittish Middle East, and then of course China trying to figure out its designs on Taiwan. So very, very risky time ahead. I will say this: I'd rather be America right now. Right? If you look at Russia and Iran and China and North Korea, I would rather be America. We have values and partners and strength and an economy that's resilient, and an innovative society. And even though we have problems at home, I would not trade where we stand in the world with any of our competitors.
Okay, am I pushing your time a little bit?
No, you're good. We're good.
Okay, I guess it's important to ask, well, why have the JCPOA negotiations stalled? What are the issues?
I mean, these are enormously complex questions. So from an Iranian perspective, or from just a sovereign state perspective, nuclear weapons mean power and strength and military capability. And we know that countries that have given up nuclear weapons or nuclear weapon or ambitions, like Ukraine, like Libya, have suffered, and that the agreements that would have kept them in place by giving up their nuclear weapons have fallen apart. You see that particularly with Ukraine, because they clearly had nuclear weapons. And so Iran, Persia, the great Middle East empire throughout history, the Persian Empire always has had big regional and global designs. Nuclear weapons are a way to advance that. They're not going to give it up easily, because that goes to the core of their design. And yet we did strike that deal, for as imperfect as it might have been in 2015. And now, after we walked away, it's clear that the Iranians are much closer to nuclear weapons. And so, ultimately they have to decide if they want to be in the community of nations, or they want to strike out as being a regional rogue power. I do think that the Israeli, Saudi, Emirati response is not predictable to the Iranians, and that remains something that is outstanding. And secondly, I think the fact that Biden has been able to put in such a strong sanctions regime against Russia would inflict damage to the Iranian economy. Having said all that, we need oil. I mean, that's just the reality of it, and that's why Biden's going to Saudi to get them to pump more oil, and the Iranians want to be able to pump more oil as well. So very, very, very tricky. It was always going to be a hard slog to get them back into the mix after we walked away. So I'm not optimistic.
Yeah. Well, it's good that you say that, because I feel like now is a good time to. I feel like the domestic popular support for getting back on the JCPOA is pretty asleep right now.
Yeah.
For example, the Senate 2 weeks ago did a non-binding amendment vote, 62 to 33 against delisting the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is one of the issues that Iran has. And so that would include 16 Democrats voted with the Republicans on that.
Yeah, I mean, that was a subset issue, right? It was delisting the IRC, but Guard, IRG.
Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Yeah, IRG. Yeah, and I also think that we have bandwidth issues, right, in America right now. So we have Roe v. Wade and the Supreme Court leaked case. We have Texas gun shooting. We have inflation. We have gas prices at a very high and likely to increase rate. We have Ukrainian war. And so, things like Iran are not, in a sense, today's problem for most people in this district. I mean, most people right now are suffering just because they have to fill up their tank, their car, or they're suffering because food prices are increased, or they're suffering because, we still have COVID and we're tipping potentially into a recession. And so, these are the driving considerations of folks in this district.
Yeah, so if you're making an appeal to somebody as to why we should want to be back on the JCPOA, you said inflationary reasons, de-escalatory reasons in the Middle East. Is there anything else that you would say to a voter?
Look, at the end of the day, what we want is a stable world. And, we don't want World War III. We don't want, a Russian invasion of Ukraine spilling out across the globe and unleashing threats from Iran and China and North Korea. We want these things contained. We want America to kind of lead the next century, to lead the next generation. We want America to be at the very forefront of building the technology and the solutions for climate impact. We want, American leadership. We want American strength. We want American economic power, and all of these things help undermine that. And so, a strong America is good for the world, and a strong America is good for this first district.
Okay. So, for example, if you were on this committee voting, would you vote for or against? Well, okay. Well, maybe I shouldn't. Maybe we should establish what the IRGC is first, because it was listed as a terrorist organization by the Trump administration when he backed off from the original JCPOA agreement. This is apparently an issue for Iran because the IRGC protects the Ayatollah, and also they also have a lot of economic capital. They apparently are in control of 1/5 of the economy. Do you think that we should take the IRGC off of the terrorist list in order to move forward with these negotiations if it soothes the feathers of Iran?
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, listen, I think that Iran is a dangerous actor, and I think that they seek to undermine the Middle East. I think that they seek to project power, and I think since 1979, they've been clear in their adversarial intent against the United States. This is just one of many threats that we have to balance right now. That's, by the way, given the complexity of the world right now, given the multiple threats that we see globally, given the multiple domestic issues. That's why we need leadership, both in the executive branch and in Congress. These are complicated matters. We need people who understand what global economics and global security, global food prices and energy prices mean on the United States, and what it means for families sitting around the kitchen table, and what it means for our future and for our kids and grandkids in terms of building and maintaining the next American century. And so, given the interlocking challenges that we face right now, it's really incumbent upon voters in the first district to make sure they choose wisely, that they choose the next member of Congress that understands these matters, the relationship of security to economics, who has experience in that, who doesn't just have vague talking points or no vision, like both of my competitors for this space, both in the general and in the primary. I grew up here. I grew up in a small town on a small farm. I went to public school in Maryland in Carroll County many decades ago. I understand what it means in Elkton and Cambridge and Denton and Dorchester. Across the counties, but also across the small towns, and how we've been left behind and how we need to grow and build a future.
Okay. Do you want to talk about China Taiwan a little bit, or do you want to segue out?
No, listen, our relationship with China, as we've been trying to move away from Russia and the Middle East and focus on Pacific theater, is going to be a defining question for our generation. And China is a rising power. China has imperial designs. China is, both a competitor in many regards, and yet we need them for some of the more complicated issues like climate change. But I will say this: we erred in outsourcing everything to China. And we did it by minimizing their adherence to labor standards, environmental standards, safety standards. Our folks cannot compete against Uyghur slave labor in China, who has no safety or environmental standards, and nor should we. These are unfair advantages that the Chinese have and that they've used to build their economy. And so, our strength is that we have friends and allies around the world. We have a strong economy ourselves, and that with our partners, we have a bigger and stronger economy. If you take the EU and North America and South Korea and Australia and Japan, just to name a few, we have a very strong bloc in globally, and I would rather be us than China. But make no mistake about it, our relationship with China, both in terms of solving problems or mitigating problems, will define the next generation.
Okay. Do you think that Xi Jinping wants to invade Taiwan in the same way that Putin is invading Ukraine right now?
I think that Putin's experience in Ukraine and its miscalculation has given pause to China. But of course, there's been little skirmishes in Taiwan in the last few days, with some overflights and some scrambling in response by the Taiwanese Air Force. And so even in the last few days, you can see some heightened risk. And of course, Biden spoke very clearly that we would defend Taiwan. I think ultimately what is most important is that we build an alliance of free of free nations, of free economies, of free people in Asia that can confront, if needed, China. But I think our goal now is to more or less manage all these risks in a way that's predictable and stable rather than escalatory. And so I'm hoping this is not a simple time. This is not a simple time. Mm-hmm. And that's why we need voters to really think carefully about who their leaders in Congress can and should be. Because there's an enormous amount at stake abroad, and there's an enormous amount at stake at home. I mean, we are among the most polarized in our time, in our history, right now. And we will either rise or fall as a great nation together. So we will rise together as a great nation. And if we fall, we will fall because we are too divided. We are a house divided. So I think it's important that we recognize that the far left and the radical right don't have America's best interests in common, and that they are hoping to break and to polarize America, when what we really need to do is to come together, find common ground, and solve complex problems.
Okay. Did you want to say anything else about China, or did you want to wrap up? What do you think?
I mean, I think, look, I appreciate the fact that you're having this podcast, that you're communicating to folks not only on the Eastern Shore, but across Maryland and across the United States. You're a smart voice on these issues. I'm just so impressed with your depth of knowledge on all of these issues. And so I'm grateful that we've had our time together. And I would just encourage listeners to, really reflect about what the summer is going to mean for us as we go through a contested primary, and then on to the general election. We want to get it right. We want to build that next American century. We want our families at home, particularly in the rural areas, to be successful. And it's who I am. I am of these communities.
Awesome. Okay, so do you want to tell people where they can find you on social media and such, and find out more about your campaign, Dave?
Yep. So my website is hardenforcongress.com. You can always write me at dave@hardenforcongress.com. I respond to everybody. We're on Twitter and Facebook. Twitter is Dave_Harden, and Facebook is hardenforcongress.com. And I try to do as many local events and local media like you, like Shore Issues and your podcast, as possible. And so, please look me up. I humbly ask for your support and your vote, and I will fight to protect and defend America and the families of this first district.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dave, for giving us your energy this morning.
Thank you, Brian. You have a great day.